So, good evening, everyone, and welcome to the KAM Summit, Awani. It's a pleasure to have you on board. I believe it's like late night in Canada right now, so thank you for doing this with us. Um, we would like to just start off by getting into your education career. We have seen that you are a BA graduate and then pursued an MBA. So, what made you get into the animation industry? Like, how much of an influence did your mom and dad play in your life because they have their careers in animation and art field respectively? So yeah.
Well, actually, for starters, thank you so much for having me. It's really great to be here. Um, and actually, that's a great question because I think my mom and dad definitely had a big influence on not just my career, but also my education. But to be honest, my journey kind of started when I was 10 years old because I had grown up seeing everything that dad was doing. And so sometimes he'd also when I wanted to know more about what he was doing, I was able to during summer vacations and stuff, just go by his office and kind of talk to everyone there and understand what they were doing. So it was always really interesting for me. And so by the time I was 10 and people would ask me, so what do you want to do when you grow up? My answer was always, I'm going to be an animator. Um, and so I guess now I'm not an animator, but it's just, I know it goes to show that back then I knew I wanted to be in media and entertainment. Um, and so one of the influences that my mom's actually had on me was when I was growing up. I know dad's schedule was always busy, but my mom and I spend a lot of time watching TV and movies. So like every weekend we'd watch over 2 to 3 different movies. And I think because of that, my love for media and entertainment really grew. Um, and so because of that, I did end up coming to Canada for a Bachelor of Arts program in cinema and media studies because I was just finding that more than just looking at cinema as is, I wanted some other way to really ground it and kind of understand how people are approaching it. And the one thing with the cinema and media studies program was that it allowed you to look at social, economic, and cultural factors, sometimes psychological factors. So it was a really great way to just ground your understanding of cinema, which I think makes a lot of sense now because we're in a time where everything's so global. So it's like small stories that are very specific are actually traveling around the world and having the most type of impact. Um, but at that time, I also found that my interest was shifting a little bit more towards like development and production. And so there was this really cool sort of like combined Master of Arts and MBA program that allowed you to specialize in arts and media administration. And actually what that did was it really helped me understand the lay of the land here because I think in terms of how everything's structured, especially also in terms of the government and funding bodies and arts organizations, there's a whole ecosystem that you have to understand. And the MBA was like really great for that. So and I guess while I was doing that, I also tried my best to kind of do internships and work and volunteer. So I was able to I had the opportunity to work with Deepa Mehta at TIFF in 2016 because she was releasing 2 films. And then I also had the opportunity to do an internship at what was then Deluxe Animation, but I guess now it's Company 3 Animation. And I also worked with this really fun outdoor film festival where it was like a summer festival. And what they do is they do these giant screenings in different parks in Toronto. And so I think that was just like a really good way to like completely understand like the animation service industry side of things, but then also understand the programming side of things, like which is like a grassroots arts organization and how that works. And so I think it's like once I'd graduated, I was talking to a lot of people because I was like, you're trying to find your first job. So I talked to so many people and then and that's where I kind of landed up in where I currently am at a company called Shaftesbury. It was started back in the 80s by a woman by the name of Christina Jennings. And honestly, that's one of my favorite facts about it because it's been around for so long. And one of its biggest strengths is primetime TV. And they were also doing really well in like live action kids and family in the early 2000s. And then overall, there was like a bit of a slump in just how things were going with kids and family production in Canada, so there wasn't as many shows, but then slowly things were kind of starting to pick back up around like 2016, 2017. So by the time when I joined, I was kind of the second person to join the kids and family department that was just starting back up again. And honestly, since then, like I started as a coordinator. And so at that point, it was a lot of like admin stuff, but helping out really put a structure to the department because things were new. We were doing things for the first time. And so I think as we were doing that, slowly like our slate's grown over the time, where it's like before we were doing a lot of digital web series, but now we're doing both. We're doing like digital web series and linear TV. And so in my current role, I do a lot of development work. So it's a lot of keeping on, like just keeping track of all the trends in the industry, what broadcasters are looking for. So that way, you know, that because that helps you kind of figure out what projects to take onto your slate, and what projects to develop further, or how, like what formats are working, what target demographics broadcasters are looking for. I get to work with writers and creators and take pitches, put forward recommendations for which projects to go forward with, and also work with writers on actually producing pitch bibles and scripts. And then the part of that is just development budgets, development funding. And then I'm also across some of the smaller digital web series productions.
In Canada, like there's a CMF and other funding bodies as well. So did what role have they played when it comes to the development of any project? How important is having these kind of bodies who are ready to fund your projects? Yeah.
Well, to be honest, they're super important, and I guess one of the reasons why we know they're super important is because there's so many of them. Like you said, there's a CMF, which is the Canada Media Fund. We've got the Bell Fund, the Independent Production Fund, the Shaw Rocket Fund, the Rogers Cable Network Fund. So there's a lot of them, and they're kind of built in a way where they help you in different parts of wherever you are, whether it's development or production. And there's also Ontario Creates. That's an important one, so I shouldn't forget that one. So I think just going back to development, yeah, development's super important. I think people put a lot of emphasis on it, and it can be anywhere from like a few months to a few years. But I think one of the benefits of having some of these funding bodies is that, you know, you don't necessarily need to put your own money, like a lot of production companies still do, because that's just a part of development. But I think what it does is kind of, it adds more money to your development pool, and it kind of allows you to do a lot more, because what we traditionally do, and depending on the project, is use the development money for a writing room, a Bible, a script. But sometimes when you've got more money, you can also do a little bit of casting, or, you know, get a research consultant. And so I think it just allows you to do a lot more. And with the Canada Media Fund specifically, that's a really interesting one, because they don't just have a development program, they also have a pre-development program. So those two are like they're a little bit different. But in pre-development, sometimes you just need a letter of interest from a broadcaster, and you can get some money to kind of just do like a script and a Bible, but no like writing room and such. But then after that, it's kind of like when you're doing development work, sometimes you usually always need a letter or just some kind of interest from a broadcaster, because what that does is, for some of the funds, it kind of just helps make your project a little bit more viable, because it shows that, you know, you've got some interest in it. So that helps them kind of be like, okay, cool, yeah, we'll put more money towards this, because some of these funds also get a little bit competitive because they're getting so many applications. So there's that side of it. And then another side of it is, sometimes when you've got a broadcaster who's interested in your project and they want to put it into development, very often they have a sort of envelope, which is just a specific amount of money that's been allocated towards development. So as they find projects that are interesting for them, you can tap into that envelope and get some money for development. And that's it's competitive when it comes to pitching to the broadcaster, but when it comes to tapping into the CMF, it's not competitive. It's like if you meet certain criteria, you'll get that money.
How open is all these funding bodies or even the broadcast industry to work with freshers? Like I would say people who are just got into the industry 2-3 years of experience. How open are they?
To be honest, it depends because, and I guess the reason I say that is some of it is changing right now because there's more initiatives now in place to help grow newcomers. But usually with a lot of these funding bodies, it's kind of like when you're applying, they need a specific amount of, like they've got some eligibility criteria from the production company that's applying. So, and that usually what that eligibility criteria is depends, but more often than not, it's like Canadian owned and you need to have some form of experience under your belt. And that can differ if it's coming from like the people you've got attached to the project or if it's coming from just your experience as a production company. But I would definitely say that usually having that kind of experience, like just having some sort of projects that you've done and having like relevant Canadian experience is sometimes what the funding bodies are looking for. But more recently, we're also seeing that there's specific types of funds that are only open to you if you've never applied before. So if you're like a first-time applicant. And that's for very specific streams because like the CMF has so many different streams, right? Because it's not just for TV, but also like for film, and they've got a regional side to things and like a whole digital media component. But the one other thing that I would add was with a lot of these funds, if they know you're a first-time applicant, they also ask you to set up a sort of hour-long session with them, so you can talk to them one-on-one about the process, which I think is really helpful because they usually do a lot of information sessions where they take you through the fund, what they're looking for, and because these applications, especially if you're doing like production applications, they're pretty big. They're massive undertakings. They require a lot of resources. And so the good thing is that they're willing to talk you through all of that and take that one-on-one time to make sure that you're ready for this application.
But can you talk about, what are the best practices or call it something that you have observed while working in the animation side of the industry that you think are something that it's something everybody should follow?
Well, to be honest, I think it's always really hard to talk about best practices because I know like working in India and working in Canada are so different. And I think some of it is just because the ecosystems are so different, right? And it's just the way everything's structured. So I think it's really hard for me to comment on like best practices, though I would say that because we where I work, our slate is primarily live action, but we do have some animation projects on our kids and family slate as well that we mostly do as service productions. And I think one of the reasons why just animation can work really well, especially in Canada, is because we've got provincial and federal tax credits. So, and usually there's criteria that you have to meet. I know there's like lots of stuff that you can look up online, but basically what's really helpful when you're working on a lot of these animation projects, because animation can be expensive, right? And so usually here, what really helps us round out the financing for any project is being able to tap into those provincial and federal tax credits that usually make up a pretty solid double-digit percentage of your complete financing. It's something that you kind of apply for after production, but it just has to do with like how much labor has been spent within either the province or the country, but it kind of helps you make some of that money back.
Okay.
And it's honestly, sorry, just to quickly add to that, it's one of the reasons why I think it's just that service production industries here do really well, is because people are able to tap into tax credits.
So that's about the finance, but in terms of the content development, like when you're developing for kids especially, what are the things that you need to keep in, like there's a lot of inclusivity and diversity which is coming into the picture. So Do you have to keep those things in mind specifically while you're developing content over there? What's it like?
That's a great question. It's also like very relevant to everything that's happening right now, because I think across North America, there's been like a general sort of awakening where people are realizing that, yeah, representation is really important. And I think people are working quite hard to do that on the kids and family side. There's a lot of research that gets done, and like reports that people do just based on what representations, like what representation currently looks like on TV. And I know there's a long way to go, but I would say that the funding bodies take it seriously. Like I think now and like more and more funding bodies, broadcasters are all being very mindful of this, and they have specific requirements about what the diversity in your project looks like, not just in front of the camera, but also behind the camera. Like, who's your above the line talent? You know, like who are your executive producers? So there, people are paying attention to this. We've got lots of really great writers, and so it's one of those things where people want to be telling different stories, because especially when you're working in kids and family, it's like you don't want a kid to not see them represented positively on TV and that having a negative impact on them and how they see themselves, which is what has happened for a really long time. But now people are realizing that that's not okay, and it's not just about maybe just grouping together all, you know, everyone who's Asian. It's like now it's more so about being specific about like what kind of Asian, where are they from, what's their story. And so it's being able to tell those perspectives, and it's just for kids, making sure that whatever it is that they see reflects the world that they're seeing around them and what their classrooms look like. And so yeah, so I think overall there's just a big push towards representation, which I think is really important. There's a long way to go, because I still don't see a lot of Indian people, like a lot of Indian kids in kids and family content here, but I think we'll get there.
The few tips for the newcomers who are going to join the animation industry, or how, and also what should they keep in mind if they want to join a development sector, what the kind of work that you do. So just yeah, but and also a few things about what's in that line in your future.
Well, I guess in terms of just starting out, there's a few things, and it kind of also depends on where you are, but I think the most important thing is just reading and watching everything you can, even if it's just like one episode of something, because it's always good to know what's out there, how people are doing things differently. So I think just like exposing yourself to that breadth of content and like watching things from everywhere around the world can always be really helpful. The one thing that I've learned that I think is just really important, and it's not something that comes, I think it didn't necessarily come as like a no-brainer to me. It was something that I learned over time, but especially here in Canada, I found that it's like when in doubt, it's just really good to be as honest as you can. And I say that because people here really appreciate that. So if you've like made a mistake or if you've forgotten to do something, it's okay to say that, because you need to know that your work ethic is going to show for that. And it doesn't really matter if you're making some mistakes or some, like if anything happens, just be honest about it. And people here are really open to that. And I think that also really helps you build your relationships, especially when you're doing development work. A lot of conversations aren't easy because you're working with a lot of different writers and like creative people, and there's always like differences. So I think as honest as you are and as understanding you are to that conversation just really helps, because you want to be respectful to people and you want them to know that you're coming from a good place. But sometimes it's like, you know, you have to do what you have to do. And I'd really say the last one is kind of like trust yourself and feel empowered, because I find that sometimes when you're here, I know it's not always home because home is back in India, but so I feel like when you're doing that and when you're doing creative work, sometimes it's really hard to be like, oh, is my opinion good enough? Or is it okay for me to say this? So I think we kind of tend to fall into a lot of, oh, I think this is the case, when you know for a fact that that is true, but you don't necessarily trust yourself to phrase it as in this is the statement. So I think, yeah, it's just really important to trust yourself. The more you do that, the more empowered you'll feel in your own life, in your own career, and that also helps you empower other people. And I feel really strongly about empowering other women. So I feel like if you can do that, then please do. And I think for me specifically, I really love development. So I'm hoping to do more and more of that if I can in the future.
So are you also going to planning to come to India sometime, like to work with some of the Indian studios or the broadcasters or anything?
That would always be the hope, because I mean, I'm always really open to that. I don't know if it's gonna be like in my immediate future, but if that happens, it'll be it'll be great to be back in India, and it'll be great to be closer to my mom and dad.
Thank you so much, Avni, for, I mean, there's a lot more we can talk about, but we have a time duration. But hopefully we'll have you here next year live on ground during the next Camp Summit 2023. And it was great having you and chatting with you and knowing more about your story.
Yeah, thank you again for having me, and I do hope we get to do this in person next year. Yeah, thank you so much, and I hope everyone out there has a great evening.